Over to you.
Welcome everyone to Workshop C, Theorizing Access. We just wanted to cover a few quick things, a few quick house rules, I guess, before we get going. So we really want to make sure, since this workshop is about access, that it's also accessible and that it embodies care. So we wanted to make explicit some agreed standards for the group with respect to just making a comment or asking a question or making a contribution. We don't want to stop discussion between everyone, but we just want to make sure everyone can participate. We know that people have different ways that they might want to or be able to communicate. So we want to make sure that they're all equally heard. That means that if you want to ask a question or make a comment, in the chat, that's a way of doing it. You can raise your hand using the reaction tab at the bottom, or just visually. I'll be trying to monitor the chat, and then other people will also be kind of monitoring the visual hands. Do try and mute your microphone if you're not speaking, just so that we have a minimum of background noise. Feel free to turn off your camera at any point. Like I said, we'll be monitoring everything. You can also always send us a private message in the chat if you just wanna, if something wasn't clear or you wanna, or there was something sensitive that was said that you just wanna bring up. We'll be using the participant list, so the name that you have under your Zoom, on your Zoom profile right now. So just make sure that that's correct, so we're not accidentally using a partner or a colleague or a sibling or a friend's name instead of yours. So we'll call on people during the discussion. If you feel like we've skipped anyone or that we haven't seen someone, also feel free to just let us know. There is live transcription available, so you can just press the CC at the bottom of the screen to access that. We know it's not always 100% accurate. So again, if you miss something, please just let us know. The session is being recorded. I think the breakout groups aren't going to be recorded, but the main session is. And then the last thing is one of the breakout groups, or at least one of the breakout groups, will be writing based instead of, so in the chat and using Zoom whiteboard rather than everyone kind of discussing speaking. So if you want to be a part of that breakout group, please let us know. Otherwise, we're going to randomly allocate people. I think that's about everything I have. If you have any follow-up remarks, you can always get in touch with us afterwards as well. We'd love to hear from you guys. And then I think I'll pass on to Anna, who's just going to give some background about how we came up with the idea of this session.
Thanks, Annelies, and hi everyone. It's great to be here again, although in a digital sort of environment. I think last time I was at a University conference, which was when I met Nicky and Annelies the first time, was now 2 summers ago in Brno in the Czech Republic. And this, I think that's part of what I won't take more than 2 minutes, but that was part of this origin story that's led us to think about this workshop today. So we began having discussions about the work that we do in museum education, especially around concerns with access and how we might theorize, but also practice access. And from that, we set up a platform that we might talk more about towards the closing of the workshop today, called Museums Engage Ed, which we've then ran a few sessions. And one of the sessions was proposed and developed by Nicky with our support, that was on this theme of theorizing access. So that's really been the prompt for us to do the workshop that we're doing here today. Thanks, Nicky. And if you are interested in Museums Engage Ed, which Nicky's just posted there, we would be really happy to keep growing. And we don't have definitive plans for how to develop it as yet, but we would like it to continue to be collaborative efforts. So I'm going to hand over to Nicky now, who will now present on this theme, and then it will be a very interactive workshop, so we will be having discussions, but it will start with an introduction from Nicky. So over to you, Nicky.
Thanks, Anna, and lovely to see everybody. Yeah, it's going to be an interactive workshop, but it's going to start with me talking at you for about 10 minutes. And this was just to sort of frame some ideas, not in any way bounding ideas, but just some ideas to think about 4 different ways of thinking about access. So Sophie, could we get the shared screen with the PowerPoint up, please? Terrific. So I wanted to talk about 4 different ways of thinking about access very briefly. Disposing of access is the first one. Making access visible is the second one. The phenomenology of access is the third one. And representing the history of access in museums is the fourth. In the museum, what is being accessed and why and how and for whom? What does it mean to be accessible? The phenomenology of access. Is this about proximity or immediacy? Literally getting close to something? The removal of barriers, physical closeness? Proximity can also mean the erasure of distance through the medium of electronic resources. Accessibility can sometimes straightforwardly mean putting things online. Sometimes proximity means getting close to things quickly. Is access an achievement, an endpoint, a gateway, a process, an imperative? Is it something that we should just be constantly mindful of? First theme, disposing of access. In a rather pessimistic article from 2003, Kevin Hetherington gives an account of what he characterizes as the disposal of the so-called problem of access. Meaningful physical and intellectual access to museums and collections for disabled people can start out as a problem, but end up as a resource for the museum, he claims, through the process of being translated into a series of literal signs on display, such as wheelchair signs on toilet doors. Access becomes carefully delimited, controlled, and literally visible. Consequently, access is reduced to a series of visible signs and indicators. Pointing at a sign, or indeed pointing at an access policy, might be a substitute for actual access, or might be a way of deflecting a discussion about access. Tanya Tikovsky says, if you have to use a sign to indicate access, then there must be an assumption of a general lack of access. Certainly, some forms of universal access or universal design explicitly want to discard the concept of having signs because everything should be default accessible. Universal design sounds like such a common sense and progressive and sensible thing, but we need to recognize that it itself has a history and a politics. What does it mean for everything to be universal? Can universal, just like access or transparency, become a rather empty claim? Theme number 2, making access visible. Could we go down a slide, please? In the genre of visible storage, various claims are made about access to the backstage, the behind the scenes, what really goes on. Storage work, collections work, conservation work are literally put on display. The thing that is made accessible is the real. Visibility is often made mandatory. This in part comes from an anxiety, a belief that things must be shown in order for them to be trusted. It's also a classical, literal, political transparency argument. Everybody has the right to see everything immediately. One of the fascinating things about visible storage is that it often treats visibility and accessibility as the same thing. Here's a quote from the director of the Brooklyn Museum in 2001. The goal will be accessibility. This will give people an idea of what storage looks like and what is in there. To be accessible here is to be seen. We can see here on the picture the immersive and literally transparent form of collections access in the proposed Victoria and Albert East Collection and Research Centre due to open in East London in 2023. This is pure visuality. We are supposed to be overwhelmed, but only by one sense, the visual sense. Glass makes everything accessible. Here is the architect, Liz Diller. Collections are all around you, below you, everywhere, and you have access to some of it. This is accessibility on display, and is accessibility reduced to visuality. Above all, this is a kind of collections engagement as physical recreation. And I think it's very interesting that there is no depiction of anyone here in a wheelchair or a wheelchair user, or any depiction of someone who is, at least from the outside, looks like they have a visual impairment. Ironically, there is a strong emphasis here on sight and on robust mobility under the guise of access. That's very interesting. This brings us on to my third theme, the phenomenology of access. Fiona Candlin wrote a brilliant book called Art, Museums, and Touch. This is a history of touch. And Candlin makes important points about how in different historical periods, there are different hierarchies of the senses. She traces the rise of the dominance of vision and its association with rationalism, and indeed the association of vision and the eye as a masculine and hence superior form of understanding and engagement. Candlin notes the diminution of other senses, such as touch, which are by contrast often characterized sometimes as feminine, as less rational. It would be a caricature to claim that touch is never viewed as complex or rational, however. At points in history, touch is deemed to be lowly when it is associated with women's work. So sometimes disregard for touching is not about the touching, but who is doing the touching. When a male sculptor in the 19th century uses their hands, for instance, they are being expert and a connoisseur. Candlin is also interested in 1970s and 1980s touch exhibitions, where tactile proxies, raised surfaces, either replace or are placed alongside works of art. One of the things that is interesting to her is how touch has become, in the past few decades, synonymous with access, but specifically becomes synonymous with the very accessibility of access. What started as an attempt to make artworks and other objects meaningfully accessible has become extended to a whole host of other museum visitors who are either conceived of as difficult to reach, marginalized, and for whom touch is sometimes rehabilitative. For instance, touch and specifically handling sessions with prisoners or people recuperating from illness in hospital or people with learning disabilities or dementia. And touch here is framed as something basic, benign, non-expert. And this brings us on to the fourth theme. Can we go down one slide, please? Representing the history of access in museums. So lastly, I want to show you this example of a piece of pavement or sidewalk curb. This is a piece of pavement or sidewalk curb which has been removed by disability activists in the 1970s who campaigned for physical accessibility of public spaces through direct intervention, taking a sledgehammer to the sidewalk in order to make a smooth curve to allow wheelchair users to cross the road. Can we go down one slide? And we can see here an image of the kind of urban space, urban architectural space we're talking about here. We can see the removal of a part of curb in order to provide access, principally for wheelchair users. And let's go back to the lump of concrete. In their history of the universal design movement, Amy Hamray theorizes about smoothness and roughness. Sometimes action needs to be rough in order to smooth things, like taking a sledgehammer to the sidewalk. Sometimes the smoothing over presents new barriers. For other road users, such as partially sighted people, the stepped curb is actually quite a useful barrier, and its replacement with smoothness creates a problem, which of course can be overcome with another form of roughness. the dimpled surface texture at crossing points, which has become a critical form of access and legibility in the urban civic space. Sometimes retrospective smoothness is represented once something has been achieved. And this is very characteristic of the memorialization of activism in museums and elsewhere. Hamre notes how curb cuts have become a metaphor for smoothing away difference, a case study in disability activism and assimilation, but also a liberal metaphor of smoothness, metaphors of ramping, and the metaphor of the electronic curb cut, which will remove all barriers and create an apparently equitable plane, a literally level playing field. And this can be a model in which perhaps an idealized form of citizenship or shared identity is at play, a rehabilitative or normative model which doesn't allow for difference or nonconformity or variation. So the history of access, finally, told through objects like this in museum collections, might tell us a lot about certain types of accessibility of the city. But what of other forms of ways in which the American city was perhaps inaccessible? What might a history of disability rights look like which intersects with a history of segregation and desegregation, for instance? Because what is quite striking about much of the kind of disability history that this object perhaps embodies is it takes whiteness as unproblematic and unremarkable. In a segregated city, or in a city where Black people feel harassed or unwelcome downtown, or in certain neighborhoods, the slope or ramp might be completely irrelevant to the accessing the civic space. And facilitating access might be about, say, reforming the police. So there's perhaps a retrospective smoothing. And lastly, we need to reflect on the privilege of who gets to undertake acts of civil disobedience in the first place, because that's not a right which is universally accessible. We know this from both historical and contemporary forms of protest. So that's just very briefly 4 different themes and suggestions for ways in which we might want to think about and problematize access. And I'm going to stop at that point.
Perfect. Thank you. We're actually right on time, which is great. Clap for ourselves. Anyway, so what we wanted to do now, after Nicky's kind of presentation, which gives some of the questions and ideas that we're going to be hopefully discussing later, is have a little discussion about language and access. And we were actually hoping that everyone could share the word for access in their own language. So you can raise your hand if you want to do it vocally, or you can do it in the chat, or both, ideally both. Yeah, Nicole, if you want to go ahead.
Hi. In South Africa, we actually have 11 national languages. I can speak 2, so English would be 1, access, and then Afrikaans, toegang. But my heritage is also German. It's my mother tongue. That would be Zugang.
I also think it's really interesting. This is something, as someone who lives in Belgium, that I deal with a lot. The fact that we talk about access, but and talking about access and language in several countries, and maybe in English-speaking countries as the main language, you don't think about it as much. But in Belgium, for example, we have 3 national languages, and language itself can be such a barrier for people. So we also have toegang as in Dutch, which is my native language.
Sebastian, what about in French?
No, in France we have only French. You know, we are kind of republic, so we decide that all regional language should be erased from the education. Well, it's not completely true, but regarding museums, for instance, I don't know quite a lot of museums that try to revive those regional language. In Alsace, of course, there is this Alsatian language, but there's no very much concern to consider that people that we don't really have yet, we don't really have anymore in France, people who don't speak French. In fact, I mean, you don't really have people who only speak one regional language. So, but of course, afterward, there is the international accessibility, but it's not, I think, the point you wanted to raise. So there might be, of course, there are experience and concern about migrants, but this is a different also thing I think you want to raise.
But we did literally just want you to tell us about like what sorts of words in the French language are used for access in a museum context, in a political, and what connotations those words have, or is it just access?
Yes, I think it's yeah. I think it's just access. You're absolutely right.
Does anyone have any experience? Because a lot of us work now in university museums, and one of the things that in our museum that we actually talk about a lot in terms of accessibility is translating our very academic language, which can be very non-accessible, especially when researchers are, like myself, are creating exhibitions. We can want to use our jargon, and having actually that step that you need to take of translating that in a way that a public can actually understand. So that's another way of looking at accessibility in language. And Nicole, if you want to say something.
Yes, in our museum, I'm actually the interpretive officer. So I engage with the public. I do the tours to school groups, pensioners, basically the complete range of visitors, including visiting academics and small kids and everybody. And it can be really quite challenging. It's not that easy. And then we have the added complication that we have visitors, international visitors, and multiple languages in the country. So I often translate my tours and museum educational programs into Afrikaans. I've also offered Afrikaans tours actually to Dutch and Belgian people before, because it's very similar to Dutch and Flemish, and German tours for so it's really quite challenging, but the challenge makes it worth it, and it really is fascinating. Doesn't cause boredom at all.
Yeah, it definitely keeps it exciting. And then Margarita.
Okay, how are you, everybody? Well, I want to tell you something about an experience of the Museum of the Universidad del Rosario at Bogota, Colombia. Well, we have at the web site, the museum, we have a tour, of course, in Spanish, in English, French, German, and Italian. And there is a time we made a little exhibition about the language of indigenous Arhuacos. That was very, very interesting. But I think the people don't understand exactly what was the interest to put these words anybody understand. And we have a big problem because at Colombia we have more or less 70 different dialects, indigenous dialects, but anybody knows about. And of course, there is a problem because these dialects are losing at this moment. then we have this interest, but we are working for a little. Is that all? Thank you.
So thank you so much, Margarita. And it's true also, as museums, we actually have the potential to showcase language in a different way, and to show those different things that, you know, if people don't know that there's 70 different languages, that's something that we can bring up. But it is true that it can sometimes be difficult to show why that's important. I just wanted to read from the chat. Meredith also wrote her contribution in the chat. So she said, I would add that many people think deaf have no limitations in museums because text is printed, but language deprivation means that many deaf do struggle to read museum labels. So we do often think in terms of, you know, people who can't see. For them, we need to have an audio guide or Braille or something else. But if the people working in the museum don't experience the different things that they're trying to build their museum to be accessible for, that can actually cause a lot of difficulties. Does anyone want to pick up on that before? Yeah, and for Braille, for blind people, not everyone can read Braille. That's also true. Does anyone else want to pick up on that before we move on to breakout groups?
Well, maybe I missed the point when I react a few days after. I'm sorry about that. But we did at the moment, because we are renovating the museum, so we do reflect about accessibility and this capacity to be I don't know if you how you can put it, but multi-accessible. So it was very challenging for the team. Because at some point, even though you want to do it, then you realize very quickly that you have to adapt to lots of specificity and lots of different kind of public with different kind of capacity to engage with the museography. So I think this is what we try to do. Instead of having only one, thing that would be sort of universally accessible for different kind of people, we try to develop, to assume that there is a kind of current accessibility, but being aware to develop different kind of tools accessible for different kind of people. Though for some point we know that it's kind of discrimination, but for sure we try to not to discriminate against when possible against the different kind of people. So of course this is and we had the chance to have a specific person in the Museum of Strasbourg who is actually working on this accessibility process. So it was very helpful. And we did work also with association of different kind of communities, blind people, deaf people, and association in charge of people with different cognitive how do you say that, sorry, different cognitive capacities and so on. So this is a very important I think point that we had in mind in the renovation. But as long as it's not open, you can't be sure it's going to be okay and it's going to work.
And do you feed that back to the students in any way through teaching? Do they get to talk to these experts, and is that fed back?
Yes, they will. They will. We didn't yet, but they will, because this is we're starting to share the process of the renovation. So we did plan to start this sharing with the student in our museological courses, and but also more than methodological. And there's a history of science and so on when we are concerned with museum.
Yeah, so I think that actually wraps it up really well, and kind of how we put that into practice and how we build our museums. The next section of our discussion, so now we talked a bit about language, and definitely keep that in the back of your mind for the breakout groups as well. Anna is going to give a quick rundown of how the breakout groups are going to work. And maybe she can also share just briefly so that everyone can see the document that we sent around, and it's also available on the Google Drive that we'll be working with. I'm creating the breakout groups right now, so once Anna's done presenting that, I'll send you all off.
Great, thanks so much, Annelies. And maybe, Annelies, if you could just pop in the link to the Google Drive again, just so everyone has it, because there's been quite a lot of chat. Okay, I might just share the screen now. Actually, that's a good idea. So you have a sense of what document we're talking about. What we're going to do next is to form some breakout groups. And we've already been having this initial discussion, and I think quite a lot of themes, important themes have been coming up. Oh, sorry. Sorry, this was some of my highlighting, sorry, ignore that. Anyway, some of the themes have been coming up around the problematics of access in terms of practice, but also how we might be theorizing. Oh yeah, Nicky's also been highlighting some of how we might be theorizing this. And I think one thing that I would like to maybe when we get to the discussion is also think about, well, if we are trying to do these changes in these museums at the level of staff representation, it's not just about visitors that might have different abilities, but what about staff that are also working in these organizations? So that's, just one of the things that I'm personally interested in. But what we're going to do now is to have these breakout groups so that we're looking at 2 access policies from 2 different cultural organizations. One is the Glasgow Women's Library that you can see here. So this is Exhibit 1. It's a very short policy. You can see it's just 1 page. And the other museum that we've chosen, Exhibit 2, is the Smithsonian Museum. So 2 different national contexts, quite different approaches, we think, to what accessibility and access means for visitors. So we'd like you to work in the groups that Annelies is creating at the moment to think about, in more concrete terms, the discussions we've been having so far. How do these policies reflect that? What do you make of these policies? How do they compare to how you're thinking about access in your own organizations? And then there's a final exhibit, if you get time to work through those policies, which is just an image, but it's an image that, Nicky chose this, and I think it's a very sort of telling exhibit in terms of that theme he was talking about, how access is represented in museums. This is at the Wellcome Collection in London. And anyway, I don't want to say much about the exhibit because there's information there about it. So this is, if you could have a browse through the policies and through the image, they will give you 15 minutes to discuss. And then we'll come back and have 20 minutes to feedback from the different groups, and that will lead to the closing then, where we have just final remarks. So I think, have I missed anything? Oh yeah, just to say that there will be, so one of the breakout groups, as Annelies said at the beginning, will be a text-based workshop. So I don't know if you've asked Annelies to be in that group, you will stay in the main space. Otherwise, Annelies will be allocating you to that space. I think that is probably everything I had to say, unless I've missed anything. Nicky, Annelies?
Nope, I don't think so. And feel free to get creative if you want to kind of collectively annotate a document or make a mind map or whatever you feel like doing.
or turn your camera off for 5 minutes of the 15 minutes to have a bit of thought on your own. That's Marta has just said that she wants to stay in the main group, which is thumbs up.
All right, then I will send you off now. Hopefully this works, fingers crossed.
Did it work? I'm nervous. I think it did, right?
Yeah, I think so too. There's one or two people who haven't yet joined.
Okay.
Their breakout groups. But other than that.
I'm not doing anything, Annelies. I am leaving all the controls to you.
Okay. So this is the text-based one. So let's all get into the chat.
Okay, we are back from the other room. It was only the 6 of us, and so we didn't all have the documentation, so we just starting to share and starting discussion on accessibility. So
Thanks, Sebastian. Great. So I think everyone's back now. Yeah, Annelies?
yeah, yes.
Okay, great. So I think we had 3 breakout groups in total. And I think maybe one thing that we could do is, given that you've had specific discussions in each of the groups, is get some feedback from what were some of the ideas discussed at the group. So maybe we could start with you, Sebastian, as you were already launching in, or your group. What did you make of these policies? What were the sort of key insights from your discussions?
Well, I'm afraid we're spending lots of time discussing together and wondering what we were supposed to do. So sorry about that. But so if we had a discussion, it was more about the fact that our colleagues from Canada said that they also had this issue of a bilingual country where there is French and English. So it's always difficult, especially because those languages, it's also a question of graphism and the capacity to use different words and the length of and also the length of those words, because in French, I do have this experience also that French is longer than English. You can synthesize. I mean, English speaking is, for some reason, more synthesized than French, and so it's not only a question of accessibility and of words and how to translate and how to use the language, but also to visibility for the people, because it's adding some complexity in the capacity of reading when you have 2 different languages, even though you're so maybe we didn't discuss that, but it reminds me of one of our experience in the museum, and the very lately, in a very few weeks ago, when we received the graphism of the different texts, because we have translation in 3 languages. And at the end, we sort of realized that nothing was readable. The first impression is that we were not in capacity to understand what we were reading. It was not only a question of being French or English or so on. It was just that the way the texts were organized by the graphist make it complex and difficult for the people to understand what they were reading. And it was a very weird experience, actually, because when you're doing, it was an effort to get access to the understanding of the text. So it's I mean, this is the short discussion we had about the accessibility and of this different language accessibility for the public.
Right, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think that builds on what we were discussing earlier, and then that we can, when we think of access, we need to think about all the different intersecting elements, and obviously language is an important aspect of that. I think there were other things that were coming up in our discussion that we'll get on to talk more about, which had more to do with how is access even being understood, like even the term access. So I'm wondering if that was something that you touched on in your group, or if anyone else wants to. Did you focus only on language, or were there any other aspects of the access policies that you were discussing, or whether it's other kinds of physical access or digital access, or anyone else?
Or just a small
Sarah.
Around. Yes, hi, I'm Sarah. I'm from Montreal, Canada.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi. Well, I think that the only issue when you're working with 2 different languages is that you really need to know very well who is your main audience, because it's there when you're going, knowing that you can prioritize which language you are putting first, probably. because sometimes you're serving a community that, for example, in my case, is English speaking, so you have to focus on English first, and then you translate to French. And probably if you are more, you're serving an area that is more French speaking, then you have to work your French first and then try to translate. So sometimes you really need to know your public in that sense.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, this is something that also it's about, or at least I find it, for instance, just to talk more I don't want to really take over much space here, but when I think all the work that I do in the museum is very much focused on working with students. And sometimes there will be also a lot of ideas or concepts that they're completely unfamiliar with. So it's how to also introduce, like, sometimes it's even if they have the word, there might be, that there is the language that you use in terms of the terminology, that also can be a problem for access. So I think, it's, there's lots to unpack, I think, when we think about language, and also, and about learning in this context. Right. Do we have any more thoughts from anyone else in that group? Or maybe we can, I don't know who was in which group, but if no one else from that group wants to feedback anything else, maybe we can have someone else from the other group.
Hi, I'm Valeria from Brazil.
Hi, Valeria.
About the language here in Brazil, sometimes we have Portuguese and English, because many people from the world don't speak Portuguese, so you need to have other language. But here, about the terminology, we can see it in many museums, because I think people, historical museums, art museums, anthropological museums here, and other kind of other typology, they use many language that are for their peers. For example, historians write to historians, artists write for artists, and many people can't understand what that kind of stuff they are talking about, and they don't ask us in museums because they think oh, I was supposed to understand that kind of language or terminology, and they don't. And sometimes people don't ask because they don't want to say they don't understand that kind of discuss. And the terminology, I think it's a good way to talk about how to make the text more simple. You need to speak for more people than you now. We don't communicate for many people, and we need to become it more easy. And I think they like to speak in a difficult way. I don't know. I'm not sure if you can understand me, because I can't hear me as well too much, because I'm
we can hear
the mask. Yeah. I'm sorry. I think the sound is. Yeah, I think it happens in many museums in the world, and I think they don't want to say here my museum speak with a language, a easy language or a simple language, and we need to rethink about that. To
thanks,
get more
Valeria.
people.
Yeah, and I think that there was something that came up in our discussion, not around language, but I think this point that I think both Marta, but also then Meredith made around that there is things haven't really been sorted if people don't feel welcome or feel like they belong in the museum. And I think it's the case for language, it's the case for other kinds of accessibility we might talk about. But yeah, it can very much be that the museum feels like a very exclusive space, or something where the language you might not be able to not just even understand, or maybe you can understand, but you feel very distanced from the kind of language that's being used, as if it's something that's not for you. And I think this point about, again, language and who belongs is critical. Do we have any other thoughts from that group? Oh, and Annelies has made a comment on the chat. Annelies, do you want to say something about that?
No, it was just about masks, just because of what was just said. I hadn't even thought about it, but my sister teaches in a school, and for them, it was suddenly with COVID, they had to, everyone was wearing a mask, right? The teachers and the students, and they suddenly realized that for a lot of students, that was actually a big problem. And suddenly they had to adapt, like they hadn't even thought about it in the school. So I assume it's a similar thing in museums. If you now have guided tours where the guides wear a mask, that means that certain people can't follow those tours anymore. And it's, yeah, for me, I feel kind of embarrassed that it's not even something that I thought about. But I see Nicole is raising her hand, so I'll stop.
Yes, over to Nicole. Thanks, Anna.
Hi. Yes, that's the mask problem is actually something we spoke about in our museum context because it does not allow lip reading. So we thought of a visor, but for example, me being the tourist guide, I can't wear a visor because of reflection in my glasses. I get dizzy from it. So I need to wear a mask to offer a tour. And sadly, we have had a lack of disabled visitors who in the museum when we were open during the time we were not in a hard lockdown. And that does become an issue if, you know, you can't provide access to people and they then feel excluded. But in group 3 in our group, we also discussed the 2 examples. And we thought that the Glasgow Women's Library, it felt like an internal document that was instructive to staff and laid out ambitions that the staff of the museum wanted to reach. Some of these ambitions, for example, reaching out to different cultural groups, seemed rather ambitious. For example, if you are in a country that does not have a lot of financial possibilities, this can become very difficult, especially also if you can't connect to people with the internet because there are internet deserts in your country. Then the Smithsonian example looked as if it was geared towards visitors, accessible on a website. So these 2 examples seemed very different. Both of them had very good suggestions, useful suggestions, but some of them were very, felt difficult to implement in other countries. Taking South Africa as an example, with the history of apartheid and segregation, this resulted in one of the biggest evils of the apartheid system was unequal education. So white people were elevated to very educated status. Black and colored people were really discriminated against and they didn't get the same education. And now we have a population that is educationally segregated. So these differences have far-reaching consequences, resulting in 60-year-old people who are completely illiterate. How do you present a museum to them? How do you make it feel inclusive to them? And also, not every blind person can read Braille. I've guided a blind gentleman with his guide dog through the museum, and he actually told me, if you become blind through an accident, it takes about 7 years to read and to learn reading Braille. So people who become blind through illness or accident don't really have the chance to learn that. So you need to also consider something like that. We also talked about financial difficulties in countries, for example, Colombia, which is fraught with war and other social inequalities. They don't have access to audio descriptive devices. So technology and funding and skills and so on is actually a really big problem in many instances.
Thanks, Nicole. Thanks for such a rich, I think there was so much there, but I'm going to hand over to Nicky, who raised his hand.
I did raise my hand. I wanted to echo what Anna just said to Nicole. Thank you for sharing. And just like to kind of follow on from that. I mean, one of my critical questions at the beginning, and it was a question, is is a term like access so capacious and so broad-reaching as to become not very meaningful, or maybe in fact its breadth and its power is exactly why it is so meaningful. So I'm in a tension as to whether a term like access, because it can encompass so many things, is not useful or perhaps actually really evocative. I mean, I'm genuinely curious what people think. I'm also interested in how words like that become either mundane or depoliticized, having once been radical, and whether that's good or bad, because language changes. And Nicole's got her hand up. Excellent.
Hi, yeah. With regard to your question, in South Africa, we feel that access actually represents inclusivity, and that it should be a goal that you should aim towards to reach. So we're working towards that goal. It's not easy to reach with limited funds, staff, capacity building, and so on. But it is definitely something that is very big. And access also should represent cultural differences, not only languages, because how you present something in a museum culturally might also discriminate against people. And in a multicultural country, South Africa calls itself the Rainbow Nation. We have so many people of different backgrounds, people who still today feel excluded. For example, the Khoisan community, their language does not form part of the 11 national languages represented in our country. And they're still fighting for their rights, while they were actually the first inhabitants, archaeologically speaking, who lived here. So it's a very complex situation, and we feel that museums should aim towards inclusivity in the form of access. Also with regard to digitization and internet access, and because people don't always have internet-enabled devices or mobile data, this is a very big disparity and inequality that in not only museums, but also education, that is not something, a gap that's easy to breach.
Right, Uncle. We need to wrap up, don't we, Marta? Sebastian is also nodding. So I think at this point, Annelies was going to cleverly bring everything together. And so I'm going to cleverly bring everything together and just say that it's been really good to get everyone's involvement. We started by telling you about a platform, a workshop that the three of us have been developing called Engage Ed. And we will have a think about getting in contact with you further, but we'd love more participants for the next academic year, wouldn't we, Anna and Annelies? But I think also just I'd like to take a point to say thank you for everyone for sharing. We've heard some really interesting stuff, and also some personal reactions, and that's really helpful. What else should I say, Annelies, at this point? I think we should wrap up, literally. If anyone's got any last minute question, there's something in the notes. It says...
Can I say something, Nicky?
Yes, of course you can.
I think that this approach to access, the so-called access that we kind of use all the time, is that you've been using. In other words, minimizing the distance between what has been artificially separated, whatever the cause, by race, by poverty, by illiteracy, by education, by whatever physical deficiency, So this approach, I think that it's very, very interesting. It's not so common. And we should continue these discussions and the implications for university museums and collections. I challenge you, let's continue this discussion somewhere. Okay, even perhaps considering, Sebastian is here, a working group about this issue. Who knows? I mean, let me know if you think this is appropriate. because I feel that so many things remain to be discussed. I really do. And it's good job for you.
Yes, good job, everybody.
Yeah.
Double thumbs up from me. I think we should two from Sebastian as well. It's lovely to see so many people. I could just keep talking. I think we should stop, and everyone needs to go and do something else. And we'll see some of you hopefully at other sessions over the next 2 days.
Yeah. But I agree with Marta. We will approach you with this idea of working groups. I think it will be a nice step to move forward, and then we can see how we can do.
Très bon.
Génial.
And definitely
Génial.
something published from the three of you,
or a special issue for UMAC-G.
on a special issue about this approach, you know, on the UMAC-G.
Yeah.
Okay.
That would be great.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, now I have to close. I'm going to stop recording. May I?
Sure.
That sounds great.
Okay.